The secrets of the bridge. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden light painting the river in shades of amber and gold. 13-year-old Liam crouched in the tall grass by the water's edge, his fishing rod resting idly beside him. This quiet spot, far from the noise of home and the demands of life, was his sanctuary. The rhythmic hum of cicadas and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface created a symphony that Liam never tired of hearing. Since his father's untimely death in a factory accident 3 years ago, life had been anything but peaceful for Liam and his mother Sarah. She worked tirelessly at the diner in town, pulling double shifts to keep their modest home afloat. Fishing had become more than just a hobby for Liam. It was a way to help put food on the table. But today, the river was stubborn, its bounty elusive. Still, he didn't mind. The stillness of the moment, the feel of the damp earth beneath him, and the whispering of the wind through the reeds were enough. That tranquility shattered in an instant. A loud thud echoed through the air, followed by the screech of tires. Liam's heart jumped as he ducked deeper into the grass. Peering through the reeds, he spotted a sleek black sedan stopped in the middle of the bridge upstream. The door flung open, and a man emerged, his silhouette sharp against the golden sky. Liam's breath caught in his throat as the man moved purposefully to the bridge railing. He was carrying something, or someone. Before Liam could process what was happening, the figure heaved their burden over the side. A splash broke the silence, the sound chilling and final. The man quickly climbed back into the car, slamming the door shut as the engine roared to life. The sedan disappeared down the road, leaving only the faint smell of burnt rubber behind. Liam froze, his pulse racing. He scanned the river, the calm surface now disturbed by ripples spreading from the splash. Then he saw it, a hand breaking the water's surface before disappearing beneath it again. Panic gripped him. Someone was in the water, and they weren't moving. For a moment, Liam was paralyzed. His first instinct was to run for help, but he knew there wasn't enough time. The river's current was strong, and whoever was out there wouldn't last long. Swallowing his fear, Liam kicked off his shoes and plunged into the water. The cold hit him like a slap, stealing the breath from his lungs. He fought against the current, his arms and legs burning as he pushed himself toward the spot where he'd last seen the hand. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached out blindly, his fingers finally brushing against fabric. Liam grabbed hold of the figure, a man, older, his body limp and unresponsive. With every ounce of strength he had, Liam pulled him toward the shore. His lungs screamed for air, his muscles aching as he dragged the man onto the muddy bank. They both collapsed, the older man lifeless, and Liam gasping for breath. When he finally looked at the man, Liam felt a wave of nausea. The stranger was pale, his silver hair matted with blood from a deep gash on his temple. Bruises lined his wrists, and his breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Liam's phone. He patted his pockets but came up empty. He must have left it by the fishing spot. The nearest hospital was miles away, and nightfall would bring predators to the riverbank. He couldn't leave the man here. "I'll get you help," Liam muttered, more to himself than to the unconscious figure. With trembling hands, he slung the man's arm over his shoulder and began the arduous journey home. The wooden door of their modest house creaked as Liam stumbled inside, the man's weight dragging against him. Sarah, still in her work uniform, was in the kitchen washing dishes. The clatter of the door startled her, and she turned, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Liam," she exclaimed, rushing over. "What happened? Who is this?" "I found him. By the river," Liam panted, his voice shaky. Someone threw him off the bridge." Sarah's face paled. "What?" "Liam, we need to call the police." "No." Liam's voice was desperate. "There's no time. He's barely alive. Mom, please, you can help him." Sarah hesitated, torn between her instincts and her son's pleading eyes. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders dropping. All right, help me get him to the couch. Together, they lowered the man onto their worn sofa. Sarah grabbed her first aid kit, her hands moving deftly as she checked his pulse and cleaned the wound on his temple. He's in bad shape, she said, her voice tight. But he's breathing. That's a start. Liam hovered close, watching her work. Will he make it? I don't know, Sarah admitted, but we'll do our best. As night fell, the man remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Liam sat nearby, unable to take his eyes off him. Who was this man? Why had someone tried to kill him? The question swirled in Liam's mind, but the answers would have to wait. The next morning, Liam woke to the sound of a low groan. He bolted upright, his heart pounding as he saw the man stirring. Sarah was already by his side, a glass of water in hand. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked gently. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and hazy. He blinked a few times before rasping. Where am I?" "You're safe," Sarah said. "My son found you by the river. You were hurt." The man's brows knitted together in confusion. The river. His voice trailed off as he touched the bandage on his head, wincing. "I don't remember." Liam leaned forward, his curiosity burning. "Do you remember who you are?" The man hesitated before murmuring, Richard Hart. The name meant nothing to Liam or his mother, but the weight of the situation was undeniable. Someone had wanted Richard dead, and now he was in their home. As Liam looked at the frail man on the couch, a strange sense of responsibility settled over him. He had saved Richard's life, and now it was up to him to uncover the truth. But neither Liam nor Sarah could have anticipated just how dangerous that truth would be. Shadows of truth. The early morning light spilled through the cracks in the curtains as Liam sat at the kitchen table, his fingers nervously tapping on the wood. His mother, Sarah, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. On the couch in the living room, Richard Hart lay still, his bandaged head resting against a pillow. The previous night's chaos had left the house heavy with tension. Liam broke the silence first. "Mom, what do you think happened to him? Why would someone throw him off the bridge?" Sarah sighed, her back still to him. "I don't know, Liam. But whoever it was, they didn't want him to survive. That much is clear." "Shouldn't we call the police?" Liam pressed. "They'd know what to do." Sarah turned, her face grim. "We don't know who's behind this. What if it's someone powerful? Someone who could find out we're involved? You've seen enough crime shows to know how this could go wrong." Liam frowned but didn't argue. Deep down, he understood her fear. Their small family had no means to fight back if they became targets. Still, the idea of doing nothing gnawed at him. As they spoke, a soft groan came from the living room. Liam was on his feet in an instant, rushing to Richard's side. The older man's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused, but alert enough to scan the room. "You're awake," Liam said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. Richard's eyes locked onto Liam. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You're the boy who pulled me from the river?" Liam nodded. "Yeah, you were floating. I thought you were dead." Richard winced as he shifted to sit up, his hand instinctively reaching for his bandaged temple. "I should be. Whoever did this wanted me gone." Sarah walked over, holding a glass of water. "Take it slow," she said, handing it to him. "You've been through a lot." Richard took a sip, his hands trembling. "Thank you. Both of you." Liam couldn't hold back his curiosity any longer. "Do you remember what happened? Who did this to you?" Richard stared into the glass for a long moment before shaking his head. "Bits and pieces. I was on the bridge. There was someone else. A man. He pushed me." "Do you know who he was?" Sarah asked, her tone careful. Richard hesitated, his brow furrowing. I think it was someone I knew. Someone close." His voice dropped, filled with disbelief. but I can't make sense of it. Liam leaned forward. What do you mean? Richard looked up, his expression dark. If I'm right, the person who tried to kill me is someone I trusted, someone who had everything to gain from my death. As the day wore on, Richard grew stronger, though the gaps in his memory frustrated him. Sarah insisted he rest while she and Liam kept watch. But Richard's unease was contagious. Liam found himself glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see a black sedan idling on the street. By late afternoon, Richard finally spoke again. There's something I need to tell you. Sarah sat down beside him while Liam perched on the arm of the couch. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. I'm not just an ordinary man. My real name, is Richard Hartwell. The name struck a chord with Sarah, and she stiffened. The philanthropist. The billionaire. Richard nodded. Yes, but that's not the whole story. I run a foundation, the Hartwell Trust. It's supposed to fund education, medical research, and disaster relief. But recently, I discovered something wrong. Liam tilted his head. What do you mean wrong? Richard's face darkened. Money was missing. Large sums. At first, I thought it was a clerical error, but the more I looked into it, the clearer it became. Someone was siphoning funds. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. And you think the person who pushed you was behind it? Richard finished. Yes, they knew I was getting too close. I'd started collecting evidence. That's why I went to the bridge that night. I was meeting someone I thought I could trust. His voice faltered, and his gaze dropped to the floor. But I was wrong. Liam spent the evening pacing the small living room, his mind racing with possibilities. If Richard was telling the truth, then whoever had tried to kill him was still out there, possibly looking for him. That thought sent a chill down Liam's spine. Mom, he said, breaking the silence. What if they come here? Sarah looked up from the chair where she'd been sitting, her hands gripping a mug of tea. They won't. No one knows he's here. But what if they do? Liam insisted. We can't just sit around waiting for them to find us. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't have the answers, Liam. I'm doing the best I can. Richard, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. I don't want to put you in danger. If you'll help me get to my house, I can retrieve the evidence I need to expose the person behind this. Sarah's eyes widened. That's too risky. If they're watching your house. I don't have a choice, Richard interrupted. If I don't act, they'll get away with everything. And next time, they won't fail. Late that night, while Sarah slept, Liam crept into the living room. Richard was still awake, staring at the ceiling with a haunted look in his eyes. You really think you can prove who did this? Liam asked softly. Richard turned his head, his expression tired but determined. Yes, I have records, bank statements, emails. It's all locked in my office. Liam hesitated before speaking again. Then we should go. Richard raised an eyebrow. We? You saved my mom and me just by being honest, Liam said, his voice firm. Now it's my turn to help you. Richard studied the boy for a long moment before nodding. All right, but we have to be careful. If they catch us, it's over. The next morning, Liam and Richard set out early, borrowing Sarah's old truck. They drove in tense silence, the weight of their mission hanging over them. As they approached the Hartwell estate, Richard's jaw tightened. There, he said, pointing to a side road. We'll park here and go in through the back. The estate was sprawling, its manicured lawns and towering gates a stark contrast to Liam's modest neighborhood. They slipped through a gap in the fence, keeping low as they made their way toward the house. Richard led Liam to a side door, pulling out a spare key from under a stone planter. Stay close, he whispered, his eyes scanning the property. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air smelled faintly of cedar and polish, and Liam couldn't help but marvel at the sheer size of the place. Richard moved quickly, guiding him toward a study on the second floor. "This is it," Richard said, closing the door behind them. He crossed to a large oak desk, unlocking a drawer and pulling out a stack of folders. "Everything we need is in here." Liam hovered by the window, his heart pounding. "Hurry," he whispered. "I think I saw movement outside." Richard's hands trembled as he stuffed the documents into a leather satchel. "Got it. Let's go." But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Richard's eyes widened, and he grabbed Liam, pulling him behind a curtain just as the door creaked open. A shadowy figure stepped into the room, their silhouette stark against the light from the hall. Liam held his breath, his heart hammering as the figure surveyed the study. After a tense moment, they turned and left, the door clicking shut behind them. "Close call," Richard murmured, his voice barely audible. "Let's move." They slipped out through the back door, retracing their steps to the truck. As they drove away, Liam glanced at Richard, who clutched the satchel like a lifeline. "We did it," Liam said, though his voice lacked confidence. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "This is just the beginning, Liam. The truth is out there now, but so are they." As they disappeared into the distance, neither noticed the black sedan pulling out of the shadows to follow them, the hunter and the prey. The tension in the small house was palpable as Liam, Richard, and Sarah gathered around the kitchen table. The leather satchel Richard had retrieved sat in the middle, its contents the key to unraveling a deadly conspiracy. Sarah's hands trembled as she poured coffee into 3 mismatched mugs. The warm scent of the drink did little to calm their nerves. Richard opened the satchel, pulling out stacks of papers, USB drives, and a worn leather-bound notebook. He spread the items across the table, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Everything we need is here," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Bank transfers, falsified invoices, emails. It's enough to take them down." Sarah folded her arms. "And what happens when they find out you're still alive? They're not going to just back off." Richard looked up, his gaze sharp. "That's why we need to move fast. Once this information is in the right hands, they'll have no choice but to run. Exposing them publicly is the only way to stop them." Liam leaned forward, unable to contain his curiosity. "What exactly did they do?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It started small, missing funds here and there, amounts I barely noticed. But over time, it grew. They funneled money into shell companies, siphoning millions meant for disaster relief and education. When I started asking questions, they panicked. And when I got too close, they decided I was expendable." Liam's stomach churned. "Who are they?" "You keep saying they, but do you know exactly who's behind this?" Richard's expression darkened. "Alan Foster, my son-in-law, is at the center of it, but he's not working alone. He has associates, lawyers, accountants, even someone in the media to control the narrative. It's a web of corruption." Sarah sat down, her face pale. "And you think this is enough to expose them?" "It has to be," Richard replied. "But we need to be strategic about how we release it. If we're not careful, they'll destroy the evidence, and us, before the truth comes out." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in shadows, Sarah double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Liam stood by the living room window, peeking through the curtains. He'd been on edge since their trip to Richard's estate, and the feeling of being watched hadn't left him. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think they know we have the evidence?" Sarah hesitated, her hand lingering on the latch. "I don't know, Liam, but we can't take any chances." Just then, Richard entered the room, holding a small device in his hand. "I need to send a portion of the evidence to someone I trust," he said. "Someone who can start building a case, but we can't use your home internet. It's too easy to trace." Sarah frowned. "So how do you plan to send it?" "There's an internet cafe on the edge of town," Richard explained. "It's public, anonymous. I'll use it to upload the files." "No way," Sarah said firmly. You can't just walk out there. What if someone's watching? Richard's jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. If we wait too long, the risk only grows. I'll go with you, Liam offered, his voice resolute. Sarah spun toward him. Absolutely not. You're staying here. But Mom, I can help, Liam protested. Besides, it's better if we don't split up. What if something happens to him? Richard stepped between them, raising a hand. Sarah, he's right. If something happens, it's better if someone's there to back me up. Sarah stared at him, her protective instincts warring with logic. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but you're both taking precautions, and Liam, you stick to him like glue. Understand? Liam nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The cafe was dimly lit, the glow of computer screens illuminating the faces of patrons hunched over their keyboards. Richard and Liam entered cautiously, their eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. Satisfied that they weren't being followed, Richard gestured for Liam to sit at a booth while he approached one of the terminals. Richard inserted a USB drive into the computer, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. Liam watched from a distance, his nerves on edge. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed deafening in the silence. Almost done, Richard murmured, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching. He attached the files to an email and typed in the address of his contact, a journalist known for exposing corruption. With a final keystroke, he hit send. As the upload bar reached 100%, Richard sighed in relief. But his relief was short-lived. The door to the cafe opened with a loud creak, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. They scanned the room, their eyes cold and calculating. Liam's breath hitched as one of the men locked eyes with him. Richard, Liam whispered urgently, sliding out of the booth. We've got company. Richard didn't look up. Stay calm. Head for the back exit. But. Go. Richard hissed, his voice leaving no room for argument. Liam slipped out of the booth and darted toward the back of the cafe, weaving between tables. He glanced over his shoulder to see Richard standing, his posture tense as the men approached. What do you want? Richard demanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The taller of the two men smirked. You've been busy, Mr. Hartwell. We'd like to have a word. I have nothing to say to you, Richard replied, inching toward the back door. The second man reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun. You're coming with us. Now. Liam burst through the back door, his chest heaving as he ran into the alley behind the cafe. He turned just in time to see Richard emerge, followed closely by the two men. Without thinking, Liam grabbed a nearby trash can lid and hurled it at the taller man, knocking the gun from his hand. Run, Richard, Liam shouted, already sprinting down the alley. Richard didn't hesitate, following Liam as the men scrambled to recover. Gunshots rang out, the sound reverberating through the narrow passage. Liam's heart pounded as he rounded a corner, his mind racing for an escape plan. Ahead, he spotted a fence with an open gate. This way, he called, leading Richard through the gap and into a neighboring yard. They weaved through gardens and over low walls, the sound of their pursuers growing fainter with each step. Finally, they reached a wooded area on the edge of town. Liam collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Richard leaned against a tree, his face pale but determined. Are you okay? Liam asked between breaths. Richard nodded, though his hands were still trembling. That was close. Too close. What do we do now? Liam asked, looking up at him. Richard's gaze hardened. We keep moving. They know we're onto them, but now we have the upper hand. The files are out there. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes to light. Liam nodded, his fear replaced by a fierce determination. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't back down. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Beneath the mask of shadows, the dim light of dawn filtered through the trees as Liam and Richard crouched in the dense underbrush, catching their breath. The wooded area provided temporary cover, but both knew it wouldn't last. Their pursuers were professionals, relentless, and resourceful. The quiet chirping of early birds offered little solace against the tension that hung in the air. "Do you think they're still after us?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his expression grim. "They won't stop until they find us. We've exposed too much, but we've bought ourselves some time. That's what matters." Liam looked up at Richard, the older man's face hardened by years of experience. "And now, betrayal. What's the plan? We can't keep running forever." Richard gave a small nod, his eyes narrowing in thought. "We need to regroup, find a safe place to lay low. Once my contact confirms they've received the files, we'll have leverage." Liam frowned. "But what if they don't act fast enough? These guys aren't going to wait around." "They won't," Richard said firmly, placing a hand on Liam's shoulder. "Trust me, once the files are in the right hands, the tide will turn." Hours later, the two emerged from the woods, their clothes streaked with dirt and sweat. The nearby town was a sleepy cluster of buildings, its streets nearly empty at this early hour. Richard scanned the area carefully before gesturing for Liam to follow. "There," Richard said, pointing to a small diner on the corner. "We'll regroup there. It's public enough to keep us safe for now." The bell above the diner door jingled as they entered, the smell of coffee and frying bacon hitting them like a warm embrace. A few patrons glanced their way but quickly returned to their meals. Richard led Liam to a booth in the back where they could keep an eye on the entrance. A waitress with a tired smile approached, placing menus on the table. "What can I get you two?" "Just coffee," Richard said, "and a glass of water for him." He nodded toward Liam, who looked like he might collapse from exhaustion. As the waitress walked away, Richard pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed out a message to his contact. "Files sent. Need confirmation. Urgent." Liam leaned forward. "Do you think they'll respond soon?" "They will," Richard said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "They have to." The coffee had grown cold by the time Richard's phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly, his eyes scanning the screen. "Received. Evidence strong. Preparing to publish. Be cautious. Your location may already be compromised." Richard exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the phone. "They've got it. It's only a matter of time before the story breaks." Liam's face lit up with hope. "So we're safe now?" Richard shook his head. "Not yet. They'll double down before the truth comes out. We need to stay ahead of them." As if on cue, the bell above the diner door jingled again. Richard's sharp gaze flicked to the entrance, his body tensing. Two men in dark suits entered, scanning the room with predatory intent. One of them held a phone to his ear, muttering something Richard couldn't make out. "Liam," Richard said quietly, his voice steady despite the danger. "Stay calm. Follow my lead." The men moved deeper into the diner, their eyes narrowing as they searched. Richard reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled bill and placing it on the table. "We're leaving. Now." They slid out of the booth, keeping their movements casual. Richard wrapped an arm around Liam's shoulders, steering him toward the back of the diner. The waitress glanced at them as they passed but said nothing. Pushing open the back door, they stepped into a narrow alley. The cool air was a sharp contrast to the warmth of the diner. Richard glanced over his shoulder, his instincts screaming that they didn't have much time. "Run," he said simply. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the alley as they sprinted toward the main street. Richard's mind raced, calculating their next move. They needed transportation, something that wouldn't draw attention. As they rounded a corner, a rusted pickup truck came into view, parked haphazardly outside a hardware store. Richard didn't hesitate. He yanked open the driver's side door, hot-wiring the vehicle with surprising ease. "Get in," he barked, and Liam scrambled into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, and Richard floored the gas pedal just as the two men emerged from the alley, their shouts drowned out by the squeal of tires. The truck sped down the street, weaving through the sparse traffic. Liam gripped the edge of the seat, his knuckles white. Where are we going? Richard's eyes were fixed on the road. Somewhere they won't think to look. They drove for hours, the landscape shifting from small towns to open countryside. Liam had dozed off, his exhaustion finally overtaking him, but Richard remained vigilant. Every shadow on the horizon, every car in the rearview mirror felt like a threat. Finally, they arrived at an abandoned farmhouse, its weathered exterior blending into the overgrown fields around it. Richard parked the truck behind the house, out of sight from the road. "This should buy us some time," he said, waking Liam. "Let's go." The inside of the farmhouse was dusty and barren, but it offered shelter. Richard set up a small camp in the living room, using supplies he'd found in the truck. Liam sat on the floor, rubbing his eyes as he watched Richard work. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Liam asked. Richard hesitated before answering. "Not right away. But we can't stay long. Once the story breaks, they'll be desperate. They'll come after anyone connected to me." Liam's stomach turned at the thought. What about my mom? What if they go after her? Richard knelt beside him, his expression serious. "Your mother's strong, and she's smart. She'll know how to handle herself. Right now, we need to focus on staying alive." The next day, as the sun rose over the empty fields, Richard's phone buzzed again. He answered quickly, his voice low. "Hello." The voice on the other end was tense. "The story's live. It's all over the news. But Richard, they've issued a bounty on you. It's not official, but it's spreading through the underworld. People will come looking." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "How much time do we have?" "Not much. Stay off the grid. I'll do what I can to redirect attention, but you're a high-value target now." Richard hung up, his jaw clenched. He turned to Liam, who was watching him intently. "What's wrong?" Liam asked. "They've put a price on my head," Richard said bluntly. "And that means we're running out of time." Liam's heart sank, but he squared his shoulders. "Then we fight back." Richard gave him a faint smile. "You're braver than most adults I know, Liam. But this isn't a fight we can win with fists. We need to stay smart." As they began preparing to leave the farmhouse, the sound of an approaching car shattered the stillness. Richard peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window, his blood running cold. A black SUV had pulled up outside, its occupants stepping out with weapons drawn. "They found us," Richard whispered. Liam's eyes widened. "What do we do?" Richard grabbed his satchel, shoving the evidence inside. "We run, and we don't look back." The two slipped out the back door, the tall grass providing a small measure of cover. As they moved toward the woods, gunshots rang out, the sound cutting through the morning air. Liam stumbled, fear threatening to overwhelm him, but Richard pulled him to his feet. "Keep moving," he shouted. As they disappeared into the trees, the fight for survival began in earnest. The odds were against them, but Richard knew one thing for certain. The truth was out, and no matter what happened next, he wouldn't let the people who tried to silence him win. The truth in the shadows. The dense canopy of trees offered Richard and Liam temporary refuge as they sprinted deeper into the forest. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground, but the beauty of the scene was lost in the chaos of their escape. The shouts of their pursuers echoed behind them, and the occasional crack of gunfire shattered the air. "Keep going," Richard urged, grabbing Liam's arm as the boy stumbled over an exposed root. I can't keep up," Liam panted, his chest heaving. His legs felt like lead, every step a monumental effort. Richard slowed just enough to keep Liam moving. "You have to. If we stop, they'll find us." The sound of crunching leaves and snapping branches grew louder, a chilling reminder of how close their enemies were. Richard scanned the area, his sharp eyes searching for anything they could use to their advantage. Up ahead, a rocky incline loomed, its uneven surface dotted with boulders and thick underbrush. "This way," Richard said, steering Liam toward the incline. "We can lose them in the rocks." The climb was grueling. Richard helped Liam navigate the steep terrain, pulling him over boulders and through narrow gaps. By the time they reached the top, both were covered in scrapes and dirt, their breaths ragged. "Stay low," Richard whispered, crouching behind a large rock. From their vantage point, they could see the black-clad men combing the forest below, their movements methodical and relentless. Liam pressed himself against the rock, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give them away. "What do we do now?" Richard's mind raced. "We wait. They'll spread out to search. When the group thins, we'll move." Liam nodded, though every fiber of his being screamed to run as far and as fast as he could. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. Time crawled as they waited, the tension palpable. Richard kept his eyes on the men below, noting their patterns and movements. He could tell they were trained, their coordination suggesting military or mercenary backgrounds. Finally, Richard whispered, "Now." He and Liam slipped away from their hiding spot, moving as silently as they could. They navigated the ridge, using the natural cover of rocks and trees to stay out of sight. Richard's heart sank when he spotted a drone hovering in the distance, its camera scanning the forest. "They've got drones," he muttered, more to himself than to Liam. "We need to move faster." As they descended the ridge, the forest began to thin, revealing an abandoned logging road. Richard paused, his instincts screaming that the open area was a trap, but they had little choice. The road was the fastest way to put distance between them and their pursuers. "We'll stick to the edges," Richard said, leading Liam along the tree line. They hadn't gone far when the rumble of engines reached their ears. Richard froze, pulling Liam behind a thick tree trunk. A convoy of black SUVs barreled down the road, their windows tinted and their license plates missing. "They're sweeping the area," Richard whispered. "Stay close to me." They waited until the vehicles passed before continuing, their steps quick but cautious. Richard's mind raced, trying to calculate their next move. They needed shelter, supplies, and a way to contact Sarah without revealing their location. By nightfall, they had reached an old ranger station, its wooden exterior weathered by years of neglect. Richard tested the door, relieved to find it unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor creaked under their weight, but it was a sanctuary compared to the forest. "We'll rest here for the night," Richard said, setting his satchel down on a dusty table. He began rummaging through the drawers, searching for anything useful. Liam sank onto a rickety chair, his exhaustion catching up to him. "Do you think they'll find us here?" "They're looking, but we gained some ground," Richard said, pulling out a first aid kit from one of the drawers. "Let me see your hands." Liam held out his scraped palms, wincing as Richard cleaned the wounds. "Why do they want you so badly? I mean, you've already sent the files. What more can they do?" Richard's expression hardened. "They don't just want to silence me, Liam. They want to send a message. If I disappear, it'll scare others into staying quiet." "But the files are just the beginning," Richard interrupted. "The truth is out, but it's not enough. They'll fight back with everything they have. That's why we have to keep going." As the night deepened, Richard sat by the window, keeping watch. Liam dozed on a makeshift bed of old blankets, his young face etched with exhaustion. Richard's thoughts drifted to Sarah. He hated putting her in danger, but he knew she was resourceful. If anyone could handle a fallout, it was her. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, reading the message from his contact. Media coverage gaining traction. Alan Foster denying involvement but under heavy scrutiny. "Watch your back. Bounty has doubled." Richard's jaw tightened. He had expected retaliation, but the stakes were rising faster than he'd anticipated. Before dawn, Richard woke Liam. "We need to move." Liam groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Already?" "They'll trace us here soon enough," Richard said, packing their supplies. "We have to stay ahead." As they stepped outside, the forest was eerily quiet. The cool morning air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. Richard led Liam back to the logging road, his senses on high alert. They hadn't gone far when a low hum filled the air. Richard looked up, spotting another drone hovering above the trees. "Run," he shouted, grabbing Liam's arm. They sprinted down the road, the drone following closely. The hum grew louder as it descended, its camera locking onto them. Richard cursed under his breath, his mind racing for a solution. Up ahead, the road curved sharply, disappearing into dense underbrush. Richard veered off the path, pulling Liam with him. They dove into the bushes just as the drone swooped lower, its camera scanning the empty road. Liam gasped for breath, his chest heaving. "They're everywhere," he said, his voice trembling. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this. Just stay with me." The next hours were a blur of movement and tension as they evaded their pursuers. Every step felt like a gamble, every noise a potential threat. By midday, they reached a small creek, its clear water a welcome sight. Richard knelt by the water's edge, splashing his face and drinking deeply. Liam followed suit, his hands trembling as he cupped the cool liquid. "What now?" Liam asked, his voice small. Richard stared at the rippling water, his reflection fractured by the current. "We find a way to turn the tables. They think they're hunting us, but they're wrong." Liam frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard's eyes hardened, a spark of determination igniting within them. "We're going to make them regret ever coming after us." Turning the tables. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest as Richard and Liam continued their journey along the creek. The sound of water rushing over rocks masked their footsteps, but Richard's eyes scanned the surroundings constantly. The weight of the satchel on his shoulder felt heavier with every step, a reminder of the evidence they carried. Evidence that had ignited a dangerous game of cat and mouse. "We need to stop running," Richard said finally, his voice firm. Liam, lagging slightly behind, looked up at him with wide eyes. "What? Stop. But they're chasing us." "They're chasing us because they think we're cornered," Richard said, kneeling to refill a water bottle from the creek. "But what if we're not? What if we fight back?" Liam hesitated, his face pale but determined. "How? They'd got cars, drones, and who knows what else." Richard looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes, all the tech in the world can't beat good old-fashioned ingenuity. The plan began to form as they rested by the creek. Richard pulled out a map he'd found in the abandoned ranger station, spreading it on a flat rock. His finger traced the lines of the logging roads and trails, stopping at a clearing marked a few miles away. "This," he said, tapping the map, "is where we'll make our stand. It's open enough to set traps and has multiple escape routes if things go south." "Traps?" Liam asked, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Richard nodded. "When I was younger, I spent time in the wilderness. My father taught me how to set snares, how to use the environment to your advantage. These men think they're hunting us, but they have no idea what we're capable of." They worked tirelessly as the night deepened, their only light coming from the moon and a small flashlight Richard had found. Using materials scavenged from the forest, branches, vines, and sharp rocks, they constructed rudimentary traps designed to slow down or injure their pursuers. Richard's hands moved with practiced efficiency, and Liam followed his instructions eagerly, finding purpose in the task. "This one will trigger if someone steps on it," Richard explained, demonstrating how a tensioned branch would snap upward, releasing a spray of thorned vines. "And this?" Liam asked, holding up a bundle of rocks tied together with vines. "A weight trap," Richard said, his eyes gleaming with approval. "We'll place it above the trail. When the vine is pulled, gravity does the rest." As they worked, Richard also prepared a decoy, a fake trail leading away from the clearing, complete with false footprints and discarded items meant to mislead their enemies. By dawn, The clearing was transformed into a labyrinth of hazards. Richard surveyed their work with satisfaction, but he knew it wasn't enough. They needed a way to draw their pursuers in without putting themselves in immediate danger. "That drone will be back," Richard said, his gaze fixed on the sky. "When it is, we'll give them something to find." Liam frowned. "Like what?" Richard reached into his satchel, pulling out a USB drive. "I'll plant a copy of the evidence where they can see it. It'll make them think we're nearby." "But won't that just make them more dangerous?" Liam asked, his voice tinged with worry. "They're already dangerous," Richard said. "This gives us control. If they're focused on the decoy, we can pick them off one by one." It wasn't long before the faint hum of a drone filled the air. Richard grabbed the USB drive and motioned for Liam to follow him to the decoy site. They placed the drive in a hollow tree trunk, its blinking light just visible from the air. Richard waved a bright piece of fabric nearby, ensuring the drone would spot it. "Now we wait," Richard said, retreating to the clearing. Liam crouched beside him, his heart pounding as the sound of engines grew louder. The black SUVs appeared at the edge of the forest, their occupants spilling out and moving toward the decoy with precision. "They're taking the bait," Richard whispered, his eyes narrowing. "Stay low and stay quiet." The first trap was triggered almost immediately. A man stepped on the tension branch, sending a spray of thorned vines into his legs. He cried out, falling to the ground as his companions rushed to help him. The noise drew more of them into the clearing. One by one, the traps activated. A weight trap dropped a bundle of rocks on two men, and another was ensnared by a vine snare, his shouts of frustration echoing through the trees. Chaos erupted as the mercenaries tried to regroup. Richard moved swiftly through the underbrush, using the distraction to take out key players. He targeted their radios first, ensuring they couldn't call for backup. Liam watched in awe as Richard worked. The older man moved with a quiet efficiency, his actions precise and deliberate. For the first time, Liam saw Richard not as a vulnerable victim, but as a fighter, someone who refused to back down. But the mercenaries were relentless. As the traps thinned their ranks, the remaining men grew more cautious, their movements methodical. One of them spotted Richard as he disabled a drone and raised his weapon. "Richard!" Liam shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Richard turned just in time, diving to the ground as a bullet whizzed past him. Liam acted on instinct, grabbing a rock and hurling it at the gunman. The projectile struck the man's arm, causing him to drop his weapon with a curse. Richard seized the opportunity, charging at the gunman and knocking him unconscious with a swift blow. "Nice throw," Richard said, giving Liam a quick nod of approval. As the sun climbed higher, the tide of the battle turned. The mercenaries, now outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to retreat. Richard and Liam watched from their vantage point as the remaining SUVs roared away, leaving their injured behind. "We did it," Liam said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and triumph. Richard nodded, though his expression remained serious. "This was just one group. They'll send more." "What now?" Liam asked, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now we finish this. No more running, no more hiding. We take the fight to them." That evening, as they made their way out of the forest, Richard's phone buzzed. It was his contact. "Alan Foster's assets frozen. Arrest imminent. Your evidence worked. Stay safe." Richard read the message aloud, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. "It's over," Liam said, his voice filled with relief. Richard shook his head. "Not yet. But we've won this battle." As they walked into the fading light, Richard felt a surge of gratitude for the boy beside him. Liam's courage and determination had been the key to their survival. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Richard knew one thing for sure. The truth had prevailed, and the fight for justice was worth every sacrifice. The relief of Richard's contact's message was fleeting. Though Alan Foster's imminent arrest was a monumental victory, Richard knew the fight wasn't over. There were still loose ends, still dangers lurking in the shadows. "Liam," Richard said as they walked through the forest, "you've been brave through all this, but I need to ask you for one more thing." Liam looked up at him, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes unwavering. "What is it?" "You need to go back to your mom," Richard said. "It's not safe for you to stay with me. Alan's men might come after you, and I can't let that happen." Liam's heart sank. "But you need help. What if they catch you?" Richard crouched down, gripping Liam's shoulders firmly. "You've done more than enough. You saved my life. You helped me expose the truth, and you've been stronger than most grown men would be in your place. But now it's my job to make sure you're safe." Liam hesitated, tears brimming in his eyes. "What about you?" "I'll be fine," Richard said with a faint smile. "I've got everything I need to finish this." They found a small town on the outskirts of the forest, where Richard used a payphone to contact Sarah. He explained everything in as much detail as he could without alarming her further. "Bring him back to me," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Please." "I will," Richard promised. "And Sarah, thank you for trusting me. I'll make sure none of this touches you or Liam again." By the time they reached Sarah's home, night had fallen. The small house, though modest, felt like a beacon of safety to Liam. Sarah opened the door the moment she saw them, pulling her son into a tight embrace. "Mom," Liam exclaimed, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Sarah looked up at Richard, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and worry. "Thank you." Richard nodded. "Take care of him. He's remarkable." Sarah smiled faintly, holding Liam close. "You take care of yourself too." Richard hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the street. His steps were heavy, but his resolve was firm. The final confrontation. With Liam safe, Richard focused on tying up the last loose end. Alan Foster. Though the files had exposed his crimes, Richard knew Alan wouldn't go down without a fight. He was cunning, resourceful, and dangerous. Richard drove to the city, his destination clear in his mind. Alan's private estate. The mansion was an imposing structure, its high walls and guarded gates a testament to Alan's paranoia. But Richard knew the layout well. After all, he had once trusted Alan as family. Using the cover of darkness, Richard slipped past the guards, his movements silent and precise. He made his way to the study, where he knew Alan would be holed up. The room was as opulent as ever, its walls lined with books that were more for show than use. Alan sat at the massive desk, his face pale but his expression defiant. "Richard," Alan said, leaning back in his chair as if expecting him. "I wondered when you'd show up." Richard stepped forward, his jaw tight. "It's over, Alan. The files are out. Your accounts are frozen. There's nowhere left for you to run." Alan smirked, though the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "You think this is over because of a few documents? I have lawyers, connections. I'll get out of this, and when I do." "You'll do nothing," Richard interrupted, his voice cold. "You've already lost everything that matters. Your wife, your reputation, your future. It's gone." Alan's smirk faltered. "Emma, she doesn't know. She'll stand by me." "No, she won't," Richard said, stepping closer. "I made sure she saw the truth. She knows exactly who you are." Alan's bravado crumbled, his shoulders slumping. You can't do this." Richard leaned over the desk, his voice low but firm. "You did this to yourself." At that moment, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached the estate. Alan's eyes widened in panic as Richard straightened, his gaze unyielding. "Goodbye, Alan," Richard said, turning to leave as the police stormed the house. The aftermath. The news of Alan Foster's arrest spread quickly. The media latched onto the story, exposing not only his crimes, but the broader corruption network he had been a part of. For Richard, it was vindication, but it was also the beginning of a long road to recovery. He returned to Sarah and Liam's house a few days later, his steps lighter but his heart heavy with everything they had endured. When Sarah opened the door, she smiled, a warmth in her eyes that Richard hadn't seen before. "You're okay," she said simply. Richard nodded. "Thanks to both of you." Liam appeared behind her, grinning. "You really did it, didn't you?" "We did it," Richard corrected, ruffling Liam's hair. As the weeks passed, Richard worked to rebuild his life, using his foundation to ensure the stolen funds were returned to the people they were meant to help. Sarah and Liam remained close, their bond with Richard growing stronger as they supported each other through the aftermath. One quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch, Liam looked up at Richard. "Do you think it's really over?" Richard stared at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Not completely, but the worst is behind us." Liam nodded, his young face thoughtful. "I'm glad you didn't give up." Richard smiled, his gaze softening. "Neither did you, and that's why we're here." For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sense of peace. The battle had been hard-fought, but the truth had prevailed, and as he sat with the people who had become his family, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together.